Very good. Open your Bibles with me, if you would, to the book of Exodus, chapter 19. And this morning, we arrive at the passage which is our verse of the month. So, Exodus 19, 5 and 6 is part of our text for this morning. It's interesting to me how universal is the impatience of children. You know, it's kind of cliche in commercials and in movies and such that children who are on the back seat of the car always ask, "Are we there yet?" And you know, the funny thing is that children don't even have to be taught that expression. A couple of years ago, when we were living in Belém, we went to visit Andrew Cummings. Andrew Cummings is a fellow New Yorker who is a missionary in Brazil, in the next state over from our state. So Belém, the country of Brazil, has states, just like the United States has states. And in Brazil, the city that we were in was Belém, and the state that we were in was called Pará. And Andrew Cummings, for years, has been working in the next state over, in the next state to the east, which was the state of Maranhão. You can all say that, right? Maranhão. Something like that. So anyway, we were on our way back from Maranhão, back to Belém, and it was a long drive, like an all-day drive. And we had just been on the road for a little while when Chloe pipes up from the back seat and asks, and Emily and I just kind of looked at each other and laughed. We're like, who taught her to say that? Apparently, it's a really natural question, perhaps the most basic question that people ask when they get on a trip. Are we there yet? Way back in Exodus chapter 3, Yahweh had promised to Moses, when you brought the people of Israel out of Egypt, you will serve God on this mountain, that is the Mount Sinai. Sinai has been the destination of the people of Israel all along. That's where they're headed. And here in Exodus chapter 19, Israel has finally arrived at Mount Sinai. They're there. They arrived. All these crises that we have seen in the wilderness were all preparation for this moment. Everything has been building up to this moment at Mount Sinai. Chapters 19 to 24 of Exodus are one big section, one group. And this section is the establishment of the covenant with Israel. So this is the covenant that is going to transform a really big family into a nation and a people. Before this moment, they were not a people. Before this moment, they were not a nation. Before this moment, they were just a really big family. It is this covenant at Mount Sinai, it is these chapters from Exodus 19 through 24 that transform this big family into a people and a nation. This covenant is basically a contract which stipulates the terms of the relationship between Yahweh and Israel. Imagine for a moment, if we jumped back in time 4,000 years to the time of Moses, what we would discover is that nations were governed by kings. And these kings were powerful. They had soldiers and they had money, but they needed supplies. They needed people to grow crops and to fashion weapons. So what would happen is that kings of large cities would reach out to the leaders of smaller villages and the people of the rural areas around their cities, and they would seek to establish a relationship with these people. So in these relationships, it was always the king who was in control. It was him who was the authority. He was the ruler of the kingdom. And this covenant that he would make with the peoples, it would lay out all of the stipulations or the rules for all the people in these villages and in the rural areas, all of the rules that they would abide by within this kingdom. In return for obedience and loyalty, the king would promise to protect the people. He had an army, and he would use that army to defend the people against invading kings. This was the normal structure of political relationships back in the time of Moses. And these contracts between kings and peoples, they were called covenants. What we discover in chapters 19 to 24 is a single large section of Exodus that is structured much like those ancient covenants between the kings and the peoples. But instead of a human king, it is Yahweh God who is making this covenant with Israel. This is unique. In all of the other ancient covenants that we have, that we've got records of, it is human kings who enter into covenant with peoples. It is never a God entering into covenant with a people. But in Israel, Yahweh is to be king, and he is to be God over the people of Israel. Israel is to be his people. So chapter 19 serves kind of like as an introduction to this covenant of Yahweh. Chapter 20 is what we call the Ten Commandments. Moses actually gives chapter 20 a title. In verse number 1, he calls it the words. And then chapters 21 to 23, that section is a separate section. It is called the judgments. And then chapter 24 is the ceremony that establishes that covenant. So it's like we have an introduction in chapter 19. Then we have the words and the judgments, which Moses says the words and the judgments together form the book of the covenant. He calls chapters 20 through 23 the book of the covenant. So you got the introduction, then you've got the book of the covenant, which is the words and the judgments, and then you have the ceremony, which formalizes this covenant between Yahweh and the people. What we're going to consider this morning is in chapter 19, in Israel's arrival at Sinai and the introduction of this covenant. Chapter 19 is structured around 3 different trips of Moses up and down the mountain. I remember when I was quite a bit younger, while we were raising support to go to Brazil, we had the opportunity to serve at a youth camp out in the Adirondacks. A pastor asked if we would be willing to help out at this youth camp. Sure, we need to learn a lot of things, so let's do it. So I was the guest speaker one year, and Emily was the counselor. It was a unique camp because they didn't actually have a big ground themselves. They had just a little place, but they're in the middle of the state park. And so they've got the whole state park as their campground. And so one day we went off canoeing, and we literally canoed for miles. The next day, we took the kids to a mountain, and they had to hike up a mountain. Now, you know me, I've always been a runner. I've always loved running. For me, it's not a problem going up and down a mountain. It was actually a lot of fun. It wasn't a particularly high mountain. It wasn't a particularly steep mountain. So I started off with a couple of the more ambitious boys, and off we went. Soon I got myself a little ways ahead and arrived to the top. I waited around a while. Nobody got there, so I started going back down. And I met most of the people about halfway up the mountain. Well, they were getting kind of, are we there yet? Kind of whining and complaining, you know? They wanted their snacks and their water. So I said, well, I'll go get them. So I ran down the mountain, and I remember just the way you run down a mountain, you're putting a lot of pressure on the front of your shoes, and I ripped my shoes to shreds. But anyway, ran down the mountain, got the water, got the snacks, ran back up the mountain, and by the time I got back up to the top, they were 3/4 of the way up. And we all had a good time. I had a lot of fun, and I think they had a decent amount of fun in the end. If I had to guess, I would say Mount Sinai was probably a little more difficult to climb up than this little mountain out in the Adirondacks. But the point is that chapter 19 of Exodus is structured around 3 ascents and descents of Moses up and down the mountain. And so what we're going to consider this morning in the message of our text is the point of the first ascent of Moses, his first trip up and down the mountain, which talks about the importance of this covenant, the significance of this covenant to the nation of Israel. Before we get to the ascent, though, we see Moses and the people of Israel arrive at Sinai. Notice with me, chapter 19, verses 1 through 2. On the 3rd new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain. They arrived. They're there. It's possible that these events that we are encountering here in chapter 19 actually happened on the day that we know as Pentecost. Several of the commentators point out that Moses is measuring time based on the new moon. And so when the text says that it was the third month, it's literally the third new moon. In other words, 7 full weeks have passed since Israel left Egypt. And this is why it's important that he says that on the same day, in the middle of verse number 1, exactly 7 full weeks have passed. Exactly 49 days have passed. And on the following day, the 50th day, Moses goes up the mountain. And that is the day that we know of as Pentecost. It was later celebrated also as the Feast of Weeks. Pentecost, by the way, is next Sunday. So we're right on target as far as going through this story. We're not behind at all. So Israel left that little town of Rephidim, which we read about last week. They come to Sinai. They've arrived at the same mountain from where God commissioned Moses back in chapter 3. The first trip of Moses up and down the mountain we discover in verses 3 through 8a. Notice with me, chapter 19, verses 3 through the beginning of verse number 8. While Moses went up to God. So Israel's encamped at the mountain. Moses goes up to God. Yahweh called to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, you can say it with me. If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." So Moses came and called the elders of the people, set before them all these words that Yahweh had commanded them. And all the people answered together and said, "All that Yahweh has spoken, we will do." So that's the first trip, up and down. Verse number 3 says that Moses went up. Verse number 7 says he came down, and then he communicated the message of Yahweh to the people. So in this first trip, we discover what is the divine purpose of the covenant. What is God's purpose in this covenant? First, notice with me when God speaks to Moses, verses 3 through 6. We sometimes call this the eagle's wings speech. Yahweh says that I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. And this is interesting because the words of Yahweh in these verses, and particularly this expression, eagle's wings, this is going to be picked up by the psalmists and the prophets throughout the history of Israel. And it's going to be one of those key metaphors that describes the relationship between Israel and Yahweh. In fact, one of the very most famous verses in all of the Bible is based on this metaphor. But it was Isaiah who said it. You will rise up with wings as you will run and not get weary. You will walk and not faint. That's a millennial promise. That's a promise that God is going to keep to Israel one day in the future. But that language of rising up on the wings of eagles, it's based on this word from Yahweh here in Exodus 19. By the way, just as an open parenthesis, this is true for a lot of the things that we'll discover over the next few chapters. From here on out, the things that happen in these next few chapters set the whole course of the history of Israel, the language of Israel, the metaphors of Israel. They're going to use these experiences and these words from Yahweh to form their poetry, to form their history. They're always going to come back to these events as the defining points of their life, their identity as a people. So, Yahweh says to Israel, I have borne you up on wings as eagles. There's actually 3 different parts to this word from Yahweh in verses 4 through 6. We've got the beginning. Yahweh reminds Israel of their history, Yahweh's history with Israel. Then in the middle, we have the covenant command. And then at the end, he's going to talk about the future of Israel based on that history and that covenant. So let's think about these 3 parts of the speech. First of all, we see Yahweh's grace in Israel's history, Yahweh's grace in Israel's history. So Yahweh begins by reminding Israel of everything that he just accomplished in the Exodus. He says he brought Israel out of Egypt on eagle's wings, and I brought you to myself. Now think about this. Let's stop. Okay, these are the words, but let's think about this for a second. Yahweh says, I brought you out on eagle's wings. Now that kind of statement takes a certain amount of faith to accept. After all, Israel has passed through a time of serious hunger, 2 times of serious thirst, and they have been attacked by enemies, all in the past 2 months. Some Israelites might have been tempted to think, eagle's wings? This is hardly the charmed life that we were expecting when we were called to be the people of Yahweh. Right? Like the only real God, and this is the way that he's going to treat us? Eagle's wings? And yet, God's purpose for Israel in carrying her to here, to Mount Sinai, on eagle's wings, was not to give Israel a charmed life. It was to grow Israel's faith in him. Had her heart not been so hard, the tests may not have been quite so severe. Then again, if her heart had not been so hard, she would hardly have been human, would she? So God's eagle's wings include hardship for the purpose of growing the faith of Israel. It takes faith to see that. Through it all, Yahweh has been showing Israel his grace. Yahweh has treated Israel with care and with grace. It is the highest act of the grace and the care of Yahweh for him to bring a people to himself. Because true satisfaction can only be found in Yahweh. And so this is what Yahweh intends to teach Israel, to be satisfied in him. Notice with me Yahweh's covenant, which is Israel's response. Yahweh brought Israel to this place for a reason. Now notice the words of verse number 5. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, ... God is calling for 2 things from Israel. First, obey my voice. Second, keep my covenant. And the point of that first one might be a little lost on us. The word obey my voice, is actually the word hear, right? Hear my voice. I say this to my daughters frequently. Are you hearing me? Often, more often, what I say is, come and look in my eyes. You're off in the other room doing what you want to be doing. I'm not just going to holler across the house. Come and look at my eyes. I want to see and know that you're hearing me. Hear my voice. This isn't a call from Yahweh to passively hear the things that he is saying. The point isn't that the sound of the voice of Yahweh is rattling around inside the heads of the Israelites. Rather, Israel is to actively hear the voice of Yahweh, which is to say they are to obey the voice of Yahweh. That's why our translation says, obey my voice. Active hearing, active participation, obey my voice. And notice how this emphasizes the internal dimension of obedience. Voices are heard and then obeyed from the inside, right? Sound goes into your ears, then it is internalized, and then whatever response that you have in regard to that voice is based on the internalization of that sound. In other words, this is an internal obedience, an obedience from the heart that Yahweh is calling for from Israel. Now notice the second part of Yahweh's purpose, keep my covenant. So now we're focused on that external covenant-keeping behavior. Everyone can see if you are keeping the covenant of Yahweh. There is a measure, there is a standard of obedience. We were mentioning this in Sunday school this morning, some 613 laws as the rabbi counted them. 613 laws, that was the standard of covenant faithfulness. In other words, Yahweh is calling on Israel both to internal and external obedience to him. This covenant of Yahweh, the covenant that Yahweh is giving to Israel, this is not a legalistic covenant as though Israel could earn her salvation through external law keeping. The covenant, as Yahweh gives it to Israel, is a call both to internal and external obedience. Yahweh calls for loyal obedience, not just legalistic obedience. The next thing we encounter here in this word from Yahweh is Yahweh's commitment in Israel's future. God has given his grace to Israel. He redeemed Israel. And now his grace is making certain demands on Israel, that Israel be loyal to the covenant relationship of Yahweh. And so finally, Yahweh reveals the results of covenant faithfulness. You shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God promises that Israel will be his people. We need to think real carefully about these promises. First of all, God says, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. This is the status of Israel, the status of Israel. Israel is to be a special treasured possession. Now, what does this mean? Well, Yahweh follows this up. He says, all the earth is mine. In other words, there is only one God over this earth, and everything that's in this earth belongs to only one God. It's interesting. Paul makes this same argument in the book of Romans as he's explaining how God is not just the God of the Jews, he's the God of the Gentiles as well, because, well, there's only one God, and the Gentiles must have a God too. It's not just enough for one people to have a God. Everybody has to have a God because everyone's got a creator. And so if there's only one God, there's only one choice out there for a God for the Gentiles. It happens to be the same God. It's the God of the Jews. There is only one God. And so all of God's creation, all of the peoples actually belong to that one God. But God is calling out this one people, this nation of Israel, as his treasured possession. One person explained it like this. It is as though the whole earth were the ring that fits on God's finger. And the priceless jewel on that ring is the nation of Israel. It's not as though Yahweh has less right over the other peoples of the earth, but he has placed a special value on this nation, Israel. This is her status. But the result of the loyal obedience is not just an elevated status among the peoples, it's also a specific role among the peoples. Notice, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These two phrases, while distinct, they actually complement one another. They're informing one another. So think with me about what it means to be a kingdom of priests. What's a kingdom? Well, a kingdom is a domain over which a king exercises authority, right? Yahweh is setting himself up as the king of Israel. And the nation of Israel is, as it were, his kingdom. A kingdom of priests. Now, that's unique. Normally, a kingdom will have priests. Normally, a kingdom is not made up entirely of priests, right? Think more generally speaking about the role of a priest. What does a priest do? What is the relation of a priest to a deity, to a god? Well, priests are the ones who have special access to the gods, right? It's not just anyone who can go into the presence of the gods. It is a priest who goes and presents himself to the gods. Only the priests have that kind of privilege to enter into the presence of the deities. Only priests are consecrated and devoted to the gods such that they can enter into the presence of the gods. I'm speaking in general terms. There are many religions out there. I know there's only one true God, but objectively speaking, there are many religions and there's many different kinds of priests. But no matter what religion you look at, priests function the same way. They're the ones who have the special access to the gods. And so it is for Israel. Israel is to be a nation of priests. They, of all the peoples in the world, on earth, they have this special relationship with Yahweh. Israel, of all the nations of the earth, Israel alone has this privilege of entering into the presence of the one true God. God has consecrated, he has devoted Israel to himself. So Israel can enter into the presence of Yahweh as a priest. But that's the privilege of a priest. What's the responsibility of a priest? What does a priest do? He does more than just go into the presence of the gods. What does a priest do? Well, a priest is designated to represent other people before the gods, right? He doesn't just come in for himself. When he comes in and offers sacrifices, he just doesn't offer sacrifices for himself. Ultimately, he's representing other people in coming in their name before the God, right? What makes a priest is that he represents other people before the gods. And so it is for Israel. Israel is a kingdom of priests. They represent the peoples to God. Israel appears before Yahweh in name of the other nations, representing the other nations. Remember, Yahweh said, "All the earth is mine." It's not like there's just a few nations or just one nation that belongs to God. All peoples belong to God, and therefore all peoples are accountable to this God. Israel is representing all the peoples before Yahweh. God has chosen Israel as the nation of priests to come before him, to represent the other nations before Yahweh. Israel is to have this role of bringing the other nations of the earth into the presence of Yahweh. That's the significance of Israel. Yahweh also says that Israel is to be a holy nation. Now, like we mentioned before, kingdom of priests and holy nation, they're not two separate ideas. They're working together to communicate one big idea, and that is the role of Israel. Israel's status, treasured possession. Role, kingdom of priests and holy nation. So what is holy nation? How does that phrase contribute to our understanding of Israel and Israel's position, Israel's responsibility? Well, what does the word holy mean? We talked about this last year. Before I went back to Brazil in August, we did a short 3-week study on worship. You remember that? And one of the things that we learned that week, one of those weeks, was the significance of this word holy. Holy is a word that has to do with dedication to something or consecration to something. The idea of holiness isn't so much separation. When we talk about Yahweh as being holy, the idea isn't that he is separate or far away. In fact, the whole point of this passage is that Yahweh is here. He is with Israel. He is talking to Moses face to face as a man talks with a friend. The point isn't some huge distance between Yahweh and Moses or Yahweh and Israel. The point is he's here, but he is dedicated to himself. He is committed to himself and to his glory. And when he calls a nation to be holy, he is calling that nation to be dedicated to him alone, to be consecrated to him alone. That's the purpose of holiness. Holiness isn't even so much in itself an ethical word. It certainly has moral implications. It's not a substitute for the word pure. It brings purity along with it because our God is a pure God. There is no defilement in him. And so to the extent that we are committed to him, we also ought to be pure. But in itself, holiness is talking about commitment, consecration, dedication to God. And so God is affirming that Israel will be his holy nation, a nation that is uniquely devoted to the worship of Yahweh out of all of the other nations. Now this is why idolatry is horrible for any nation, but even more from Israel. Israel, who of all the nations is supposed to be dedicated to Yahweh. This Yahweh uses the analogy of, and it's more than just an analogy, of adultery when he talks about this immorality of idolatry in the nation of Israel. Because of all of the nations, Israel is supposed to be consecrated to Yahweh alone. And here, for years and years and years, she defiles herself in idolatry. Yahweh has called Israel to be a holy nation, a nation that is uniquely devoted to him. And if Israel will keep God's covenant, She will be a special nation to Yahweh, a nation devoted to Yahweh. And this is all important. We talked last week about the Abrahamic covenant, remember? And maybe it was a couple weeks ago now when there was the two different peoples. It was last week. Two peoples, and a nation that cursed Israel and a nation that blessed Israel. That was the third part of the Abrahamic covenant. Yahweh said, I will curse those who curse you, and him who blesses you I will bless. Well, in that same covenant, Yahweh promised that he would make of Abraham a great nation. In this act, when Yahweh calls Israel to be a holy nation, he is beginning to fulfill that covenant promise that he made to Abraham. Moses is writing these words. He's writing this book to the nation of Israel so that Israel as a nation would know who she is. What is her role and responsibility? Yahweh is basing his choice and his election of Israel on that language of the Abrahamic covenant. Yahweh will bless those who bless Abraham. He will curse those who curse Abraham. And in him all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. How are the other families of the earth blessed? They were to be blessed as Israel represented them to Yahweh. He's fulfilling his promise. What is Yahweh doing in this speech? This is a big, important speech that Yahweh is giving to the nation of Israel. What is he doing? In fact, he's giving Israel the big idea, if you will, perhaps even the big idea of the Old Testament, maybe even of the whole Bible. The main story of the Bible is this. Yahweh created a world. And when Yahweh created this world, he created it with the purpose of establishing a kingdom over which he would rule. But he would rule over this kingdom indirectly through king priests, if you will, human beings who were created in the image of God as steward kings, responsible over the earth and accountable to God. But Adam and Eve failed in their responsibility, and they were driven from that kingdom, from that Garden of Eden. But God never abandoned his purpose. He never abandoned his plan to establish his kingdom on earth. And Israel is the means through which Yahweh will establish this kingdom on earth. Yahweh is establishing this kingdom through this covenant with Israel. God establishes this covenant based on his grace. He has graciously redeemed Israel out of Egypt to himself. And his grace demands the loyalty of Israel to this covenant relationship. And the result of God's grace and the result of Israel's loyalty is that Israel will be the chosen people of Yahweh, this kingdom of priests and a holy nation to the world. Remember, the structure of chapter 19 is a series of ascents and descents, trips up and down the mountain on the part of Moses. So Moses went up the mountain, he got the message from Yahweh, and now he comes and brings the message back to the people of Israel. Moses came and called the elders, verse number 7, of the people, and set before them all these words that Yahweh had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, all that Yahweh has spoken, we will do. Israel's committed. They're going to do it. They want to enter into this covenant with Yahweh. This is a courageous and admirable response, isn't it? Certainly after hearing God recount his grace to them and being given this challenge to obey the voice of Yahweh and to keep his covenant, being told again, reminded again of this privilege of election and responsibility in obedience, Israel is naturally going to want to live up to this challenge. All that Yahweh says we will do. We don't have time this morning to finish chapter 19. If you want to, we can keep going, but I don't think we really have time to finish chapter 19 and all of the ups and downs. But we spent a lot of time on these couple verses for a really important reason. This isn't just about the life of Israel in the Old Testament. These verses are very important to us as the church. Yahweh established the nation of Israel as a covenant community and his kingdom. He established his kingdom through that people. But, like we all know, there was a fundamental problem with the people of Israel. Yahweh calls them to obey his voice and to keep his covenant, and they all say, all that Yahweh says we will do. But does obedience to Yahweh depend on personal commitment or personal desire? We all know this. It does not. Is obedience to the law of Yahweh something that we're capable of doing in our own strength? No, it's not. And Moses makes this clear to Israel. Later on in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verses 2 to 4, Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, you have seen all that Yahweh did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, the great trials that your eyes saw, the signs and those great wonders. Now listen, but to this day Yahweh has not given you a heart to understand or eyes to see or ears to hear. Yahweh said to his people, hear my voice. The people responded, all that Yahweh has spoken we will do. And yet Moses says, Yahweh has not given you a heart to perceive, eyes to see, and ears to hear. Even though Yahweh said, hear my voice, and the people said, we hear, we'll obey, they in fact did not have ears to hear, and they didn't obey. The covenant in itself, the law in itself is insufficient. Why is that? Why is the Mosaic covenant and the law in itself insufficient? Why couldn't Israel just commit herself to trying hard to be all that God wanted her to be, obey God's law and keep his commandments? Well, this is exactly the point of Paul in his letters to the Romans and to the Galatians. It is impossible for us to try hard enough, because any effort in our own strength is by definition in our own strength. And we are sinful people with affections that are opposed to God. And this is why we need the gospel. This is why we need to be regenerated, changed from the inside. We need to be given ears to hear and hearts to obey. And that only comes by the gift of God. Do you see this truth? Do you see that you cannot please God and keep his commands in your own strength? The gospel tells us that you cannot do it. And because you cannot do it, you are a condemned enemy of God. But the gospel also tells us that Jesus did it. Jesus kept all the covenant of God, and he offers you his own righteousness, his own obedience, if you will believe that he is God, that he is your only hope of righteousness before an eternally holy and just God. If you believe that he died on the cross as the payment for your disobedience and rebellion, and he was resurrected for your righteousness, he will save you. He will give you ears to hear and a heart to obey. That's the gospel. It's interesting, you know now, we read this morning, Peter quotes Exodus 19:5 and 6 in his letter to the Christians. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verses 9 through 10, Peter says to Christians, not to Israel, but to Christians, to the church, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of the darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Peter is talking to the church, and he's using this language of Exodus 19 and God's covenant with the nation of Israel to talk to the church. The church is now said to be the people of God, God's covenant people. That's us, if we have believed in Jesus. The church doesn't take the place of Israel, but comes along Israel as another people of God. But there's a fundamental difference between Israel before Sinai and the church before the cross. Israel didn't have ears to hear and hearts to obey. Israel as a nation was not regenerate. Certainly, there were some who were saved, like Moses and others. But as a people, they didn't have ears to hear, and they fell in disobedience. But we, as the church, by our very nature, by what makes us the people of God, we have been given ears to hear. When we believe the gospel and place our faith in this Jesus as our Savior, we have been given ears to hear and hearts to obey. This is our identity as the church. Like Israel of old, God has designated us a royal priesthood, His royal priesthood. We are sons of the kingdom, Jesus says in Matthew 13. We are priests before God in a lost world. And we are a holy nation. We are dedicated and consecrated to the service of Yahweh. Everything we just learned about Israel and the importance of all those titles and the status and the roles of Israel, that has now been conferred upon us as the church. We are the covenant people of Yahweh. We have the Spirit of God living within us, and He has circumcised our hearts and regenerated our lives. And so together we can renew this covenant before Yahweh. We can truly say all that Yahweh has said, we will do. And we say that not dependent on our own strength, but on the strength of God who lives in us. Peter goes on to say, if anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. If anyone ministers, let him do it with the ability which God supplies, that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belong the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen. Father, we thank you for your word to us. There is much here for us to learn and apply. We are your people, not because of our obedience, not because of law-keeping, not because you saw something admirable in us, but because of your grace. Like Israel of old, you have carried us out of the slavery of sin on eagle's wings, and you have brought us to yourself to worship you. Like Israel of old, you have called us as your treasured possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. We thank you for this amazing privilege. Father, before you this morning, we hear your words, your call to us as your holy nation is a call to purity. It is a call to a holy life before an unholy world. It is a call to dedication and consecration to you alone, though the things of this world pry at our hearts and pull our desires. You show yourself more glorious. You show yourself more valuable. You have circumcised our hearts. Father, incline our hearts to you. Let us see your glory and value your beauty more deeply than we value the things of this world. Loosen our grip on this age. Fix our eyes on you, I pray. You have called us to be this kingdom of priests to the nation, to the town of Albion. Father, I pray that as we carry this gospel to this town, Father, that you would call those in this town to yourself. Father, give us courage and conviction in our representation of your gospel. We again thank you that you have called us to be your people. And we commit ourselves to all the words that you have said. In the name of our Savior, amen.